Hello everyone, my name is Neetu Dalal. Welcome back to my YouTube channel called Edu Classes, wherein we cover every topic related to psychology, and currently we are covering class 12th NCERT series. So in today's video, we are going to cover class 12 psychology NCERT chapter 5 therapeutic approaches. And before I begin with the chapter, I want to say that if you're looking for the notes of these chapters that we've covered so far, you can comment your email ID below this video and I will make sure that the notes reaches you. Without wasting any more further time, let's get into the video. So the first is the index. These are all the topics that we will be covering in this particular chapter. So we have nature and processes of psychotherapy, therapeutic relationship. Then we also have types of therapies, right? So within this, we will be covering what are some of the steps in formulation of a client's problem. So this is a part of a therapeutic relationship where we try to understand as to how we go about in solving a client's problem. Some of the very important topics in this chapter are your psychodynamic therapy, behavior therapy, relaxation procedures, cognitive therapy, humanistic existential therapy, biomedical therapy, alternative therapies, and rehabilitation of the mentally ill. So these are some of the topics that we will be covering within this chapter. Now, without wasting any more time, let's start with the first topic, which is nature and process of psychotherapy. So we need to understand as to what psychotherapy means. And as the definition says, that psychotherapy is a voluntary relationship between the one seeking treatment or the client and the one who treats or the therapist. यानी साइकोथेरेपी हम उस प्रोसेस को कहते हैं, उस वॉलंटरी रिलेशनशिप को कहते हैं जो उन दोनों लोगों के बीच में है. The first one is the one who wants to take help, right? Or we also call this person the client. And the second one is the therapist or the person who's going to treat the problem. So psychotherapy is any voluntary relationship between somebody who is looking for help, the client, and between somebody who's ready to help or who will be treating the problem, which is called the therapist. Now, the purpose of the relationship is to help the client to solve the psychological problem being faced by her or him. इस पूरे प्रोसेस का एकमात्र यही पर्पस होता है कि जो क्लाइंट आपके पास जिस प्रॉब्लम को लेकर आ रहा है वो प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व हो जाए. So the relationship is conducive for building the trust of the client so that problems may be freely discussed. Now it is also very important कि आप ऐसा अपनी साइकोथेरेपी रिलेशनशिप में आपकी इतना ट्रस्ट हो कि जो इंसान या जो क्लाइंट आपके पास कोई प्रॉब्लम लेकर आ रहा है वो विदाउट एनी फियर, विदाउट एनी जजमेंट वो अपनी प्रॉब्लम को आपके साथ खुलकर डिस्कस कर पाए. सो दैट इज ऑल्सो वन कैरेक्टरिस्टिक ऑफ योर psychotherapy. Next one is psychotherapy's aim at changing the maladaptive behaviors, decreasing the sense of personal distress and helping the client to adapt better to her or his environment. यानी psychotherapy का जो aim होता है that is to change maladaptive behavior. Now we all know what is maladaptive behavior. Maladaptive behavior, all those behaviors which are not helping you to adapt in the environment are known as maladaptive behavior. This also there's another aim of psychotherapy that is to reduce distress of the client. यानी अगर आपके पास जो client आया है that is under extreme stress, so the immediate goal is also to reduce that stress. And of course, you have to help the client in adapting better to his or her environment. That is an unsaid goal of psychotherapy. Another point is inadequate marital, occupational, and social adjustment also require that major changes be made in an individual's personal environment. Even if the person is suffering at a marital problem, at a marital front, occupational front, or social adjustment front, then also all of these problems can be solved in given the fact that there are changes that are made in individuals' personal environment, right? So all of these problems are also the ones which could be addressed by changing a person's attitude or person's behavior, right? So this is the nature of psychotherapy. As we'll go ahead in the chapter, we'll understand more about it and the concepts will become more clearer. Now, the next heading is characteristics of psychotherapeutic approaches. Now, there are different approaches that a therapist could take. Now, there's a difference. We are calling the whole process of psychotherapy. The person who's taking this is the therapist, right? So, a therapist can indulge or use different therapies depending on his choice, his experience, his training. right? All all psychotherapeutic approaches have the following characteristic. No matter what approach he'll be following, all the psychotherapeutic approaches will have some of these common approaches or some of these common characteristics. One being, there is systematic application of principles underlying the different theories of therapy. यानी कोई भी approach हो, कोई भी therapeutic approach हो, उसके एक systematic application of principles का तरीका होगा. जो भी उसके अंदर principles theories हैं, उनको use करने का there will be a systematic application which will be followed by the therapist. Person who have received practical training under expert supervision can practice psychotherapy and not everybody. यानी वही लोग psychotherapy कर सकते हैं जिनको expert supervision के अंदर training मिली हुई है. Not everybody can practice psychotherapy. The therapeutic situation involves a therapist and a client who seeks and receives help for his or her personal or emotional problems. यानी no matter what psychotherapeutic approach it is, every psychotherapeutic approach consists of a person or a client seeking help from a trained professional who is the therapist. The interaction of these two people, the therapist and the client, results in the consolidation, formation of the therapeutic relationship. This is a confidential, interpersonal and dynamic relationship. यानी जो ये एक therapeutic relationship या जो इन दो लोगों के interaction का जो result होता है, that is a therapeutic relationship which is confidential, interpersonal and dynamic, which means that जो भी इन दोनों लोगों के बीच में बातें होंगी वो completely confidential होंगी. ये एक बहुत ही, it's a relationship which is based on trust, which is dynamic and it is very interpersonal, right? So these are some of the common characteristics of every psychotherapeutic approach. Now these are some of the major aims of therapy. What does therapy achieve? So these are some of the aims that the therapy wants to achieve or foresees to achieve. All psychotherapies aim at a few or all of the following goals. Now it is not necessary that all psychotherapies will have all of these goals. No, they can fulfill some of these goals, or they can have either they can have all or some of these goals. So no, it's not like every therapeutic relationship will have all of these goals which are listed below, right? So the first is reinforcing clients' resolve for betterment. Yani, the person who's coming to you, you have to make sure that you're, reinforcing the client's resolve for his betterment, and you're trying to solve his problem so that you are actually helping him reach a better place. Lessening emotional pressure. You have to make sure every therapy aims to lessen the emotional pressure which is currently there on the client and tries to help with that. Unfolding the potential for positive growth. Every therapy also tries to aim to help the person in, achieving their maximum potential and strive for growth. Modifying habits. Some of the therapies could also help the person in changing their maladaptive behaviors or their maladaptive habits. Changing thinking patterns, यानी आप कुछ ऐसे thinking patterns भी हो सकते हैं which are not helping the client or which are not functional in nature. So then the therapy could also aim in changing these thinking patterns. Increasing self-awareness, right? Now there could be some client who wants to understand more about himself, or the person doesn't know what kind of behavioral patterns he indulges in. So then the therapy can also aim in helping the person increase self-awareness. Improving interpersonal relations and communications. There are many therapies whose major goal is to improve relationship amongst the family or communication amongst the family, right? So then these kinds of therapies, they try and help with interpersonal relationship issues, and they try to help the client in making these relationships more smooth and more better for the person. Facilitating decision making. A lot of therapies also help the person. They don't advise that what decisions you should take, but then it always the therapist always tries to help you in deciding or arriving at a right decision for yourself. Becoming aware of one's choices in life. This could be another aim of the therapy. Relating to one's social environment in a more creative and self-aware manner. So these are all aims of therapies that can be there. Either a few of them or all of them could be the aim of a therapy. Now we again talk about therapeutic relationship. Relationship between the client and the therapist is known as the therapeutic relationship or alliance. Now we understand this by now, that what is a therapeutic relationship? The relationship between the client who's come here to seek help and the therapist who is ready or who's trained to give help. This relationship or this alliance is known as a therapeutic relationship. There are two major components of a therapeutic relationship. Now, every therapeutic relationship consists of two components. The first is contractual nature of the relationship, right? This is the first component. Now, what does it mean? It means that two willing individuals, the client and the therapist, enter into a partnership which aims at helping the client overcome his or her problems. यानी ये एक कॉन्ट्रैक्चुअल तरह का रिलेशनशिप है जिसमें जो थेरेपिस्ट और क्लाइंट है वो सोली इसीलिए एंटर कर रहे हैं बिकॉज they want that this relationship should help the client, and once that is done the relationship will get terminated, right? So therefore it is contractual, so it is only for a limited period of time. Limited duration of the therapy. This alliance lasts until the client becomes able to deal with his or her problems and take control of his or her life. Second component is that this is for a limited period of time, limited duration of the therapy exists, and the relationship will only exist till the point that the client or the person who's come with a problem does not reach a solution to his problem and is not able to solve his problem and is able to control his life on his or her own terms. The next topic in this chapter is unique properties of therapeutic relationship. These are some of the special characteristics or some of the properties that every therapeutic relationship is supposed to have. The first one of these properties is trusting and confiding relationship. Like I mentioned earlier as well, that this is a relationship where the client can completely trust you and confide into you, and you're not supposed to share the information that the client is sharing with you with any other person or in any other form, whether it is print, whether it is research, or it is about talking to somebody. So therefore it is a property, or it is a characteristic of the relationship, that whatever is being discussed in that relationship will not leave that room or will not go beyond the two people involved. The next characteristic is that there are no judgment involved whatsoever. So no matter what the client is sharing with you, you're not supposed to judge the person as to whether what the person has done is right or wrong. You listen to the person without any attached judgments, and that's another beautiful characteristics of this relationship. Then there is unconditional positive regard. What we mean by unconditional positive regard is that the therapist always need to have a positive, attitude, or have a positive regard towards the client, and it should not be based on any conditions. It is something like how our parents love us, or how our parents have a positive outlook towards us, regardless of what we do. So they do not judge us. They do not hold any conditions towards loving us, and in the same manner a therapist should also have unconditional positive regard for the client, regardless of what the client does or client says. It is a therapist's duty, and it is an ethical guideline that the therapist should always have unconditional positive regard towards the client. Another important feature of this relationship is empathy. So the therapist should not just sympathize with the person, but empathize with the person, right? So when it is empathy, in a relationship, it becomes and broadens into a healing relationship. So the therapist understands and feels as if he's in the shoes of the client, and is able to help the client in the same manner he'll help himself if given the fact that if he'll be in something very similar to that. So therefore, this therapeutic relationship, given that there is empathy, becomes into a healing relationship. And the last point is also confidentiality, right? So it says that whatever you're discussing, and it is very similar to like on the same lines of trust and confiding relationship, but confidentiality also includes a clause that the information which is being brought up during the sessions will not leave the room and between these two people, and will not be shared with anybody else. So these are some of the unique properties of a therapeutic relationship. Then what are some types of therapies that exist, right? So psychotherapies differ in their concepts, methods, and techniques. And on the basis of these, whether it is the concepts, methods, and techniques, we can broadly classify psychotherapies of being majorly of three types. One is psychodynamic, then behavior, and existential psychotherapies. We've already covered the theory of all these therapies that we're talking about in the previous chapters. So if in case you've not covered these, and if in case you've not covered the chapter which consists the theories of these, I recommend that you go back to the previous chapters and cover the theories first and then come on to the therapies. So how do we decide that which therapy would work best for the client or which therapy is going to be used? So that's dependent on some certain parameters, out of which we have listed 6 here below. So which psychotherapy we will choose will depend on the answers of these 6 questions, right? So whether we will use psychodynamic, behavior, or existential, we'll primarily come to what we will be using on the basis of these 6 questions, right? Now the first is, what is the cause which has led to this problem, right? And every psychotherapy has a different way of approaching this question. So whether if it is psychodynamic, that would so if it is psychodynamic, it would understand that the cause would primarily lie in your childhood, and that is something what you've experienced in your early childhood till the time you're 4 years old or 5 years old. That's what has led to this problem. But on the other hand, if you'll talk about behavior therapy will then look at it in terms of how your behaviors have been conditioned and what has been your learning pattern. So therefore, every answer, every question will be approached in a different perspective by a different psychotherapy. So therefore, it's very important that these answers these questions are answered, and on the basis of those, an appropriate psychotherapy is chosen. The second question is, how did the cause come into existence? The third would be, what is the chief method of treatment? It also depends on, there are under these 3 different therapies, there are different treatment tools that a therapist is going to use. So depending on that as well, we classify therapies into different 3 broad categories that we've talked about. The next question would be, what is the nature of the therapeutic relationship between the client and the therapist? Fifth, what is the chief benefit to the client? Sixth, what is the duration of treatment? So on the basis of the answers that we will get to these questions, the therapies are classified into different types. But we do need to understand one thing, that all psychotherapy shares the common method of providing treatment for psychological distress through psychological means. The aim, the purpose of every psychotherapy is the same, which is to help the client in dealing with their distress or dealing with their problem which is at hand. But they only vary in terms of their concept, their methods and techniques, and probably the kind of the time that we will require in a specific therapy. Apart from that, the major goal of the therapies remain the same. Now, so the next topic, which is there in your syllabus, is steps in the formulation of a client's problem. So how do we decide what the client is dealing with, right? And so these are 3 steps that are taken care of, or 3 steps which are followed to understand that, and that's how a client's problem is formulated. So the first step here is understanding of the problem. So it is very important that the therapist is able to understand the full implication of the distress being experienced by the client, because unless the therapist doesn't understand what the client is going through, what are its repercussions for the client, how is it hampering the client in dealing with his day-to-day life, unless there is a complete understanding on the therapist ends, it's not going to lead into a very fruitful therapeutic relationship. Therefore, this is a very important and a very major step where the therapist understands as to what what is the problem and what is the depth of the problem. So therefore, it becomes very critical. The next important step is identification of the areas to be targeted for treatment and psychotherapy. Now at stage 1, where we've identified that what is the problem, at stage 2, we have to decide and identify some of the areas on which we will start working in the therapeutic sessions, right? So for example, if a client seeks help for inability to hold a job and reports inability to face superiors, The clinical formulation in behavior therapy would state it is a lack of assertiveness skills and anxiety. So for example, if a client is coming to you and saying that the person is not able to stand up to their bosses, or is not able to deal with stressful situations, once the therapist has understood the problem, the clinical diagnosis would probably be that the person has anxiety and the person lacks assertive skills. So once we've identified what is the problem, we can also identify what will be the immediate goal. So therefore, the few areas that can be targeted initial goals could be reducing anxiety and working on your assertiveness skills, right? So that's the second step. Third step is choice of techniques for treatment. Once you've decided what what is the goal that you're going to be working on, then you've reached a stage where you will have to decide what tools and what techniques will be used for treatment. So the choice of techniques for treatment depends on the therapeutic system in which the therapist has been trained. So for example, if the therapist comes from a psychodynamic school, right, of theory, then the person will probably involve different tools like dream analysis or free association. But if the person is coming from a behavior school of thought, then the person would involve different kinds of tools. So every psychotherapy or every therapy, whether it's psychodynamic, behavior, or existential, involves different tools and techniques, and which one will the therapist use completely depends on the environment that he's trained in, right? So the clinical formulation is an ongoing process. Formulations may require reformulations as clinical insights are gained in the process of therapy. So the clinical formulations that we've talked about is an ongoing process, and as the therapy progresses, these goals could be reformulated and can be worked on, right, during the process of therapy. Now we come to a very important part of this chapter, which is therapies. And this is what you should be targeting at from exam point of view, because this is what will primarily appear in your question papers as well. Under this topic, we are going to broadly talk about the following 7 therapies, out of which we have psychodynamic therapy, behavior therapy, relaxation procedures, cognitive therapy, humanistic existential therapy, biomedical therapy, alternative therapies. These are all kind of therapies that exist in the field of psychology, and we're going to talk about them, each one of them, one by one. We've covered psychodynamic theory in the chapter Self and Personality in great detail. So I recommend that everybody who's not gone through that chapter should go through that chapter first, because then they'll be understanding the theory, and therefore it will become easier to understand the psychodynamic therapy once you are clear about psychodynamic theory, right? But for those who've covered, it's just a refreshing of your knowledge that this was given by Sigmund Freud, and it is the oldest form of psychotherapy. And psychodynamics talks about your structure of the psyche. It talks about id, ego, superego, again, concepts that we've already explained in the chapter Self and Personalities. In this part, in this chapter, we will be primarily covering 3 broad topics under this psychodynamic therapy, and those are methods of eliciting the nature of intrapsychic conflict, modality of treatment, and duration of treatment. So we will not try to understand the concepts of the theory as such, but we will look at these more practical aspects in this chapter. So the first one that I mentioned was methods of eliciting the nature of intrapsychic conflict. Whether it is psychodynamic therapy, whether it will be behavior therapy, there will be certain tools and techniques that they would be using. And in psychoanalysis, because that's the topic that we're covering now, in psychoanalysis, we primarily have 2 techniques, which are free association and dream interpretation. These are the 2 important methods that are used for eliciting the intrapsychic conflicts. Now, what is an intrapsychic conflict? An intrapsychic conflict is basically a conflict within the personality of a person or within the psyche of a person which exists. So to surface that, and because Sigmund Freud's theory believes that every issue that we're facing today is somewhere repressed down in our childhood. So we use free association and dream interpretation as a way to dive deep into our unconscious and bring up bring the surface, which we bring the content that we've repressed to the surface. But primarily the one which is very frequently used is the free association method, and this is primarily used today for understanding the client's problem. We'll go into depth in free association method, because then the questions that you guys will be getting will specifically be about free association, and you will have to mention in detail. Therefore, I have made sure that I'm covering these topics in detail. Whatever I cover in detail, take a hint that that's important and that might come in your exam paper. So, be smart. Anyways, so talking about this, once a therapeutic relationship is established and the client feels comfortable, the therapist makes him or her lie down on the couch, close his or her eyes, and asks him or her to speak whatever comes to mind without consorting, without censoring it in any way. The client is encouraged to feel freely associate one thought with another, and this method is called the method of free association. तो होता क्या है, जब क्लाइंट के और थेरेपिस्ट के बीच में एक कंफर्ट, एक ट्रस्टिंग रिलेशनशिप बिल्ड हो जाता है, then the therapist asks the client to lie down on a comfortable couch and just start saying whatever is coming to his mind, right? And the client is actually encouraged to connect one thought with some other random thought, and this process goes on, right? And this is the method of free association. It's freely, why are we using the term free association? Because it's free, your thoughts are free, you can think of anything, and the client can probably just say whatever is coming to his head. And association, because you are connecting the thoughts which are existing, and there is supposed to be no censoring, which is to be there from the either the client's end or like the therapist end, right? So it's free association. The censoring superego and the watchful ego are kept inside as the client speaks whatever comes to mind in an atmosphere that is relaxing and trusting. As the therapist does not interpret the free flow of ideas, desires, and conflicts of the unconscious, which had been suppressed by the ego, emerged into the conscious mind. The logic behind this method is that once the therapist, once the two of them have become comfortable and the therapist is not interfering in the process, धीरे धीरे क्या होता है, जो भी इंसान के दबे हुए रिप्रेस थॉट्स एंड रिप्रेस डिजायर्स होते हैं, वो सरफेस पे आने लग जाते हैं, एंड द क्लाइंट starts talking about forbidden things in the session, and this actually helps the therapist reach your unconscious mind. This free uncensored verbal narrative of the client is a window into the client's unconscious to which the therapist gains access to. यानी ये जो फ्री अनसेंसर्ड वर्बल नैरेटिव है क्लाइंट का, ये थेरेपिस्ट को हेल्प करता है इन रीचिंग the client's unconscious, and the therapist gains access to it. So that is the process of free association. It is very important to understand, and this is probably is going to be there in your paper. So all right, along with this technique, along with free association, psychodynamic also uses something known as dream interpretation or dream analysis. So what happens in this is that the therapist asks the clients to write down his dreams. Whatever the person is dreaming at night while he's sleeping, the therapist asks the person to remember those dreams and probably write it down, right, after he wakes up. And psychoanalysts, they look upon dreams as symbols of unfulfilled desires present in the unconscious. The images of the dreams are symbols which signify intrapsychic forces. Dreams use symbols because they are indirect expression and hence would not alter the ego. If the unfulfilled desires are expressed directly, the ever vigilant ego would suppress them, and that would lead to anxiety. These symbols are interpreted according to an accepted convention of translation as the indicators of unfulfilled desires and conflicts. So basically what they want to say is that जो जितने भी आपके साइको एनालिटिक या साइको डायनेमिक थेरेपिस्ट होते हैं, they look at dreams from a very interpretative way, and they feel कि जो इंसान, there are some things that are forbidden to talk about, or there are some taboos in society. जिन चीजों के बारे में हम खुलकर बात नहीं कर सकते हैं, वो चीजें हमें अपने सपने में दिखाई देती हैं in symbolic forms, in metaphoric forms. तो जो therapist होते हैं, वो they ask you your dreams, and on the basis of what dreams are being repeated, what is what are you dreaming about, like most of the times, and by the content of the dreams that you're writing, the therapist tries to access your unconscious mind and then sees as to what the problems is इसका एक ट्रांसलेशन का प्रॉपर इंडिकेटर और प्रॉपर कन्वेंशन है विच इज एक्सेप्टेड एंड विच एग्जिस्ट. सो इसकी जो इंटरप्रिटेशन या स्कोरिंग होती है दैट इज डन बाय एन इंटरप्रिटेशन और अ कन्वेंशन विच एग्जिस्ट, राइट. Now we talk about what is the modality of treatment. हमने अभी बात की है tools की या techniques की, क्या techniques use होती हैं. Now we will talk about कि treatment का modality क्या है. So under this, the two major means for treating the patient, or how once you've got to know कि क्या problem है through आपने free association लगवा दिया patients client पे and you've done dream analysis. Now once you've understood what the problem is, how will you treat it? How will you help the person? So there are two types of there are two ways in which a psychodynamic will be able to help the client, and those two ways are, first is transfer. We'll talk about what is transference and how do we treat a person or a client facing an issue through transference. This is again very important. So you will be getting a question on psychodynamic theory or either one of the theories, and you have to explain all the all the techniques, modality, and the duration. So pay attention to this because this is a little tricky concept to understand. So the first one is transference. As the unconscious forces are brought into the conscious realm through free association and dream interpretation described above, the client starts identifying the therapist with the authority figure of the past, usually childhood. तो बेसिकली जब आपने किसी क्लाइंट पे फ्री एसोसिएशन या इंटरप्रिटेशन के थ्रू उनका जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट है वो उजागर हो गया है, देन व्हाट हैपेंस इज कि जो क्लाइंट है वो उसकी लाइफ में जो भी एक मेजर अथॉरिटी फिगर होता है, चाहे वो स्ट्रिक्ट पापा रहे हो, चाहे वो कोई ग्रैंड पेरेंट रहा हो, वो उस इंसान की छवि अपने थेरेपिस्ट में देखने लग जाता है, राइट. दिस इज समथिंग विच इज ऑल्सो बीन शोन इन द मूवी भूल भुलैया. तो जो विद्या बालन का कैरेक्टर होता है वो उस चीज को ट्रांसफर कर देता है एंड वो उनका जो एक छवि होती है वो अक्षय कुमार में देखने लग जाती है. इफ यू सीन द मूवी यू विल प्रोबब्ली रिलेट विद दिस. सो दैट इज आल्सो ट्रांसफरेंस वेयर यू आर एसोसिएटिंग somebody, some authoritative figure from the past to somebody who's there with you in the present, right? So here what happens is the client starts identifying the therapist with the authority figure, right? And generally the authority figure is from the childhood. The therapist may be seen as the punitive father or as the negligent mother. जिस भी इंसान की वजह से आपको कॉन्फ्लिक्ट अराइज हो रहा है या जो भी एक अथॉरिटी फिगर था उसी के साथ आप रिलेट करेंगे अपने थेरेपिस्ट को. The therapist maintains a non-judgmental yet permissive attitude and allows the client to continue with this process of emotional identification. जो थेरेपिस्ट है उसे समझ आ रहा होता है that this transference is happening, but without saying anything they let this process continue because this is also a way through which the person, the client, is actually emotionally identifying himself, or there is a process, there's a healing which is happening. This process is known as transference. Why it's called transference? Because आपने वो अपने पास से एक इंसान की छवि को अपने प्रेजेंट में जो इंसान है उस पर ट्रांसफर कर दिया. Therefore it is known as transference. You've started seeing maybe a strict father into your therapist in the moment, and this happens. This takes a while, this takes a number of sessions, but this happens. The therapist encourages this process because it helps him or her in understanding the unconscious conflict of the client. अब जब वो इंसान ट्रांसफरेंस की स्टेट में है, he will be talking, he'll be saying what has happened, वो incidents बताएगा, examples बताएगा, and this process is actually encouraged by the therapist because he wants to understand कि client के unconscious में क्या क्या है, he wants to understand that, therefore he doesn't disturb this process. The client acts out her or his frustrations, anger, fear, and depression that she or he has harbored towards that person in the past but could not express at that time. क्योंकि what happens a lot of times is जब बच्चे के साथ वो कुछ चीजें वैसी हुई होती हैं जिसकी वजह से he's it's very traumatizing for the person and the person has pushed it into their unconscious mind. Uस time पे the person is a child and they are not able to react to it, they are not able to do anything about it. Therefore during the process of transference they can project it or they can transfer it to the client, and they mostly they express frustration, they are angry, they are fearful, and they express whatever they couldn't back in the days to the therapist. The therapist here becomes a substitute for that person in the present. This stage is known as transference neurosis. वो stage जब आपका therapist has become a substitute for that person who was in the past, right? This stage is known as transference neurosis. A full-blown transference neurosis is helpful in making the therapist aware of the nature of intrapsychic conflicts suffered by the client. This helps the therapist understand कि आपके client ने what all this full-blown transference neurosis. This could be a positive transference or it could be a negative transference. Positive transference में क्या होता है, जो client होता है, he either idolizes or falls in love with the therapist and seeks the therapist approval. So it's a positive, there are positive emotions, there is either love or there is idolization that happens, but it's a positive neurosis. In the negative transference, what happens is that the client starts having feeling of anger, resentment, hostility towards the therapist. He will start hating the therapist, right? So that's a negative transference. The process of transference is met with resistance. अब ऐसा नहीं है that it will be a very free flowing emotion. There will be resistance from the client's end. क्योंकि जो transference का process है, that exposes the unconscious wishes and conflicts of the therapist. Therefore, the client somewhere resists, and the client has this inhibition and is this hesitation where he doesn't want to open up or he doesn't want to transfer. Due to resistance, the client opposes the progress of therapy in order to protect himself or herself from the recall of painful unconscious memory. Now imagine कि जब client अपने past में से किसी difficult traumatizing situation से एक character को आप पे project या आप पे transfer कर रहा है, so he's also living that again, right? So for him, that process is very, very difficult, and therefore the client tries to resist this as much as possible, and it can be a painful unconscious memory. Resistance can be conscious or unconscious. Conscious resistance, दो तरीके की resistance हो सकती है, या तो conscious या unconscious. Conscious में होगा जहां पे जो client है वो जानबूझकर कुछ information छुपा रहा है. The client is aware of the information, but he's hiding it. Unconscious resistance तब होती है जब client becomes shant, when the client becomes silent and doesn't speak during the therapy session and recalls very unimportant details without recalling important ones, right? So he doesn't want to talk about something which is very emotional, but we'll keep talking about silly things about the episodes. And the person will either start to, or, the person will try to miss the therapy sessions or come late for the session so that there is lesser time, because it's a hard process to go into, right? It's not easy. The therapist overcomes the resistance by repeatedly confronting the patient about it and by uncovering emotions such as anxiety, fear, or shame, which are causing the resistance. But even if the client is resisting the process, the therapist will keep repeatedly confronting the patient and will strive against the resistance, and he will start talking about the anxiety that the person is facing, or fear or shame, which is leading to resistance. So this is primarily what transference is all about, right? And this is again another important way of treating the problem, because once the person transfers onto the therapist, the therapist gets to know a lot about the problem. And once you've gotten to know where the problem stems from, then it's very, very easy. And during the transference process itself, on the basis of how the therapist is reacting, the problem or the issue at hand could be resolved, like it happened in the movie Bhul Bhulaiya. I'm sure everybody who's watched it will remember how the problem got solved, right? Another modality of treatment is your interpretation. Now, interpretation is the fundamental mechanism by which change is affected. Interpretation basically means giving meaning to something, right? How do you understand something? That is interpretation. Within this, there are two techniques again. One is confrontation and the other one is clarification. In confrontation, what happens is the therapist points out to the client an aspect of his or her psyche that must be faced by the client. कई बार क्या होता है that people have their own issues, people have their own emotional patterns, but they don't want to confront it. They have their own issues. So in confrontation, the therapist, in a very polite, very subtle way, points out to the client some aspects of a psyche which is problematic or which is maladaptive, right? So, and that's how the problem gets treated. On the other hand, in clarification, it's a process by which the therapist brings a vague or confusing event into sharp focus. Sometimes it also happens that the client is facing a lot of issues because he has no clarity or because he's not understanding the whole scenario in a better way. So their clarification works really good, because then the therapist can actually help and work with the client in enabling him to understand the problem better, and it becomes more clearer. This is done by separating and highlighting important details about the event from unimportant ones. Like I said, the person is not able to focus and is not able to decide or doesn't see the picture very clearly. So yahan pe the therapist helps the person in separating events which are not important from the ones which are important. And interpretation is a more subtle process. It is considered to be a pinnacle of psychoanalysis. So it is the highest that psychoanalysis achieves. The therapist uses the unconscious material that has been uncovered in the process of reassociation, dream interpretation, transference, and resistance to make the client aware of the psychic contents and conflicts which have led to the occurrence of certain events, symptoms, and conflicts. By using all of the above that we've talked about, whether it is free association, whether it is dream interpretation, transference, resistance, the therapist makes the client aware of the conflicts and the content that's available in his unconscious mind, which are leading to certain symptoms and certain conflicts. Interpretation can focus on intrapsychic conflict or on deprivation suffered in childhood. तो जो आपका interpretation है, that can either work on your conflict that the person is facing or what the client has been deprived of in the childhood. So it can work on either what the conflict is today, or it can work on what the child has suffered in the past. The repeated process of using confrontation, clarification, and interpretation is known as working through. This stage where the therapist is using the techniques of confrontation, clarification, interpretation is known as working through. Working through helps the patient to understand herself or himself and the source of problem, and to integrate the uncovered material into his or her ego. All of this process helps the person in understanding himself better, in feeding this into his ego that okay, he can do this, and he understands the problem and he gets to know himself about in a better way. This outcome of this working through is known as insight. Insight is not a sudden event, but it's a gradual process where the unconscious memories are repeatedly integrated into conscious awareness. So there we understand it like there are two sections of the brain. One is your unconsciousness and the other is your consciousness, right? So working through is actually helping you bring the unconscious content into your conscious one, and accepting that, becoming okay with that, and without feeling any anxiety or without feeling any hesitation around that process, right? And as this process continues, the client is able to understand himself or herself better at intellectual and emotional level and gain insight into his or her conflicts and problems. The intellectual understanding is the intellectual insight. The emotional understanding, acceptance of one's irrational reaction to the unpleasant events of the past, and the willingness to change emotionally as well as making the changes emotional insight. Basically, once you're helping the person to understand about himself better, you're using these techniques where you're working through the process. Once the person is completely okay with his unconscious matter coming into his conscious and has accepted that without any anxiety, the role of psychoanalysis is achieved, and therefore the psychoanalysis is terminated at that very stage where the person has become a psychologically healthy person, and we understand that the sessions need to be terminated there. Now we talk about duration of treatment. कि ये सब करने में what is the time duration that goes behind it? Now, because it is the oldest one and it was given by Sigmund Freud, who have worked for years and years, psychoanalysis should generally last for several years, with 1 hour session for 4 to 5 days per week. It is an intense treatment. Yani agar in every week, if you're going for a session for 4 to 5 days, still it will take you several years to walk through this process, because it is not a one-day thing and it is not a one-day event. It is a long, lengthy, gradual process which takes years and times, right? And there are 3 stages in this treatment, or there are 3 stages of treatment that occur. The first is your initial phase. In this, the client becomes familiar with the routines, establishes a therapeutic relationship with the analyst, and gets some relief with the process of recollecting the superficial material from the consciousness about the past and present troublesome event. So basically, this is the initial phase where the therapist and the client is getting to know each other, and they are trying to, collect primary information about what the problem is and how, what issues the client is facing. Next stage is the middle phase. This second phase is a long process, and it is characterized by transference, resistance on the part of the client, and confrontation and clarification on the therapist part. ये वो process है जहाँ पे एक बार आपका relationship बन गया है and you've reached a stage in your relationship where now you can apply the techniques, or you can start treating the problem through transference and resistance and working through. All of these process, as discussed earlier, lead to insight. And the third or the last phase of this process is your termination phase, wherein the relationship with the analyst is dissolved and the client prepares to leave the therapy. The last stage is when the person has achieved insight and is now at much more peace. The conflict has been resolved through working on the person, and that's when termination phase arises. And this is when this therapeutic relationship, which was a contractual relationship, is now dissolved and the client leaves the therapy, right? So this is what falls under the psychodynamic therapy. So that's a wrap on psychodynamic therapy, which was a longer one. So we've covered that in this part of the video. We will be covering up behavior therapy, relaxation procedures, cognitive therapy, humanistic existential therapy, biomedical therapy, and alternative therapy in upcoming videos. I'll try to keep it as crisp, as short, as concise as possible. But then these are topics which need to be understood. So it will take a little time into explanation as well as on your part to understand, but have patience and hopefully we'll get through this, right? So I'll be covering these topics in the next video. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching our series. I know a lot of you are writing into us and loving the series. I hope to continue this and finish till chapter 9, hopefully as soon as possible. Till then, stay safe and keep watching, keep learning. Bye. Has he gone through? And the other one is interpretation, right?